In the early decades of the 20th century, America was a nation in transition. Cities grew taller with new skyscrapers. Immigrant families crowded into neighborhoods, chasing the promise of opportunity. Industry roared, trains cut across the land, and modern life seemed unstoppable. But hidden within this progress was another story, one written in shadows, whispered in fear. Among the millions who blended into the streets of New York was an old man who, at first glance, seemed ordinary. He was small, frail, with thinning grey hair and the weary posture of age. He spoke softly, politely. To children, he appeared almost gentle, the kind of grandfather figure you might trust without hesitation. But appearances deceive. Behind the mask of civility, Albert Fish harbored desires that defied imagination. While others carried dreams of a brighter future, he carried tools of pain, needles, knives, and fantasies of blood. To the public, his true nature would only emerge years later. Newspapers gave him names that chilled the spine: the Grey Man, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Werewolf of Wisteria. Each title reflected a different face of the same nightmare, each whispered in terror among families desperate to protect their children. For decades, Fish prowled the streets of New York and beyond. He targeted the most vulnerable, young children, lured by the promise of candy, a hot meal, or few coins. What followed was not simply murder, but acts of unspeakable cruelty, sadism fused with ritual, torture mingled with cannibalism. His crimes would shock even seasoned detectives, hardened by years of violence, leaving them speechless. Yet the most terrifying aspect of Albert Fish was not the brutality itself, but the disguise he wore. Evil is expected to look monstrous. Instead, here it lived in the body of a frail, unremarkable man who smiled at neighbors and walked the same streets as everyone else. He was the embodiment of horror, hidden in plain sight. A nightmare dressed in the skin of the ordinary. This is the story of Albert Fish, the story of how one fragile old man, invisible in a crowd, became America's living boogeyman. A childhood of darkness. Albert Fish was born in Washington, D.C. in 1870, into a family already marked by instability and illness. His father, Randall, was 75 years old at the time of his birth, an elderly man unable to provide stability for a growing child. When Randall died just 5 years later, Albert's mother, Ellen, was left widowed, impoverished, and unable to care for her young son. With no other choice, she placed Albert in St. John's Orphanage, a place that should have been a refuge, but became the crucible of his darkest desires. The orphanage was notorious for harsh discipline. The caretakers whipped the children brutally for the smallest mistakes, their cries echoing through the halls. For most children, the punishments brought only fear and trauma, but Albert was different. He later confessed that the pain stirred something inside him, a disturbing mixture of fear and excitement. He discovered that physical suffering aroused him. In his own words, the beatings made me happy. That early conditioning rewired his sense of pleasure and pain, planting the seeds of sadomasochism that would dominate his entire life. The torment did not stop with corporal punishment. Older children bullied and abused the younger ones. Hunger and neglect were constant. In this environment, young Albert learned two things: that the world was cruel, and that cruelty could also be a source of gratification. When his mother regained some financial stability and removed him from the orphanage, it was already too late. The damage was done. Albert had learned to equate pain with pleasure, and he carried that twisted belief into adolescence. By his teenage years, he began experimenting with self-punishment. He would insert needles into his skin, drive them deep into his pelvis, and whip himself until blood streamed down his back. These acts were not isolated curiosities. They were compulsions, rituals that gave him the same thrill other boys his age might have found in sports or romance. Mental illness ran through the Fish family like a curse. Several relatives had been institutionalized for psychosis. Others suffered from severe depression or paranoid delusions. To Albert, madness was not just an environment, it was an inheritance. Combined with the sadistic pleasures forged in the orphanage, it created a perfect storm. While other children dreamed of play and adventure, Albert Fish dreamed of pain. He did not merely endure abuse, he embraced it. And in doing so, he set himself on a path that would one day make him one of the most feared killers in American history. Catalogue of error. Albert Fish's trail of violence did not happen overnight. It stretched across decades, a slow, burning nightmare of disappearances, torture, and murder. Each case revealed not just brutality, but a ritualistic obsession that marked him as something beyond a man, a monster stalking the streets of America. The earliest case tied to him dated back to 1910, when Fish worked as a house painter in Delaware. There, he met a young man named Thomas Kedden. At first, it seemed like friendship. Fish lured Kedden with promises of work and companionship, but soon revealed his true nature. He tied Kedden up in an isolated farmhouse for 2 weeks, subjecting him to unspeakable tortures. According to Fish's own confession, he mutilated Kedden's body with scissors and knives before leaving him to die. Though there was little physical evidence by the time investigators looked back, the sheer cruelty marked the beginning of his long descent into horror. By 1924, Fish's violence turned toward children. On Staten Island, 8-year-old Francis McDonnell was last seen playing near his home. Witnesses described a strange sight, a frail old man with grey hair and a drooping mustache walking hand in hand with the boy. Hours later, Francis's body was discovered in a wooded area, hanging from a tree branch. He had been strangled with his own suspenders. Scratches and bruises across his body told detectives the boy had struggled but stood no chance. This murder would later be one of the first officially linked to Fish, earning him the nickname whispered by locals, the Grey Man. 3 years later, in 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney vanished while playing in the hallway of his Brooklyn apartment building. Another child, barely older than Billy, later told police he saw an old man with a grey mustache leading the boy away by the hand. For years, Billy's fate remained unknown, but when Fish was finally arrested, he confessed in horrifying detail. He claimed he had abducted Billy, stripped him naked, whipped him until his body bled, burned him with a blowtorch, cut his flesh into pieces, and consumed parts of him. These words, delivered coldly, broke even the most hardened detectives. Then came the crime that defined his legacy, the murder of Grace Budd in 1928. Fish had approached the Budd family with a lie. He claimed he was a wealthy farmer seeking to hire their teenage son. But once inside their home, he shifted his attention. With the charm of an elderly gentleman, he convinced the Budds to let 10-year-old Grace accompany him to what he described as a birthday party. Grace never came back. For 6 agonizing years, her disappearance was a mystery. Then in 1934, the Budds received a letter. Written by Fish himself, it described in nauseating detail how he had lured Grace into an abandoned house, strangled her, dismembered her body, and cooked her flesh in his oven. He even wrote about how he roasted her buttocks and ate them. The grotesque confession turned the family's grief into unbearable horror. That letter would become one of the most infamous pieces of evidence in American criminal history. Yet even these crimes may represent only a fraction of Fish's violence. In conversations with detectives, he boasted of killing a child in every state. Investigators suspected him in numerous other disappearances across New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. While the evidence was never conclusive, his own words suggested a far greater scope than anyone could prove. Whether his boasts were the ravings of a madman or chilling confessions, one fact was undeniable. The murders Albert Fish admitted to were acts of unimaginable cruelty. He did not simply kill, he ritualized suffering. He turned murder into obsession and horror into his life's purpose. Capture, trial, and execution. On the morning of January 16, 1936, the prison at Sing Sing in Ossining, New York, was tense. Guards, reporters, and a handful of selected witnesses gathered for the execution of Albert Fish, a man already branded by the press as the Boogeyman. He was 65 years old, frail, grey, and looked like a grandfather, yet the crimes tied to his name were unspeakable. Fish walked calmly into the death chamber. Some witnesses later remarked that he looked almost eager, muttering that he was ready for his final thrill. His pale, thin body was strapped tightly to the electric chair, leather belts binding his chest, arms, and legs. A metal cap with a wet sponge was lowered onto his shaved head, ensuring the current would pass through. Another electrode was attached to his leg. As the executioner prepared the switch, Fish reportedly whispered, "This will be the supreme thrill of my life." His words sent a shiver through the room. At 11:06 a.m., the first jolt of electricity surged through his body. His frail frame stiffened violently, his fists clenching as smoke rose from the helmet. Some witnesses said they could smell burning flesh. The current was cut, then reapplied for a second and third cycle. By 11:09 a.m., Albert Fish was pronounced dead. There was a chilling detail that became part of his legend. Fish had spent years inserting needles into his own body as part of his masochistic rituals. X-rays taken before his death revealed more than 29 needles lodged deep in his pelvic region. Some witnesses claimed that these metal fragments caused complications in the execution, making the electric chair spark and sputter. Whether this was fact or rumor, it only added to the horror of his final moments. For those who watched the execution was the end of a nightmare. But the image of Albert Fish, calm, smiling, almost joyful as he met the chair, left an unease that would linger long after the current stopped. Legacy of horror. The execution of Albert Fish in 1936 silenced the man, but not the shadow he cast. His name lingered long after his death, whispered in fear, etched into American culture as a chilling reminder: evil does not always appear young, violent, or obvious. Sometimes it hides behind the frailty of an old man. The press branded him with names that carried horror in every syllable: the Grey Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire. To children of the era, his story was not a bedtime tale, but a nightmare come alive, a real boogeyman. Parents invoked his name as warning: don't talk to strangers, don't wander too far, or Albert Fish will find you. For criminologists, Fish became a case study in the extremes of sadism and psychosis. His X-rays, showing 29 needles buried deep within his pelvis, remain one of the most grotesque artifacts in true crime. His infamous letter to the Budd family, describing in cold detail the murder and cannibalism of Grace, stands as one of the darkest documents ever presented in an American courtroom. But beyond the case files, Fish's legacy forced society to face uncomfortable truths: that childhood abuse can twist a life beyond recognition, that untreated madness can fester into monstrosity, and that evil often wears the most ordinary mask. Nearly a century later, his story is retold in books, documentaries, and films, not to glorify him, but to remember the warning. Albert Fish was not merely a killer, he was proof that darkness can grow quietly in silence, that cruelty can be handed down like a curse, and that the ordinary can conceal the unthinkable. His name remains etched in history, not as myth, not as legend, but as a reminder that sometimes the monsters are real.